Section 1. The hunger from beyond the stars. There is a silence that comes before the end of a world. Not the silence of peace or of a quiet night when the stars hang low and the air is still. This is a different kind of silence. It is the silence of a signal dying. It is the silence of an astropath falling to the floor, pressing their hands against their temples, eyes wide and sightless, trying to scream, but finding that the warp, that vast psychic ocean upon which all communication across the Imperium depends, has been smothered like a candle pressed between two fingers. The silence of every navigator on every ship suddenly unable to feel the beacon of the Astronomicon, as though someone has drawn a curtain between them and the light of the Emperor. The silence that falls over a planet when it realizes in the most primal part of its collective soul that it is already alone, already abandoned, already consumed. That silence has a name. The Imperium calls it the shadow in the warp, and it means the Tyranids are coming. In a setting as brutal and overcrowded with catastrophic threats as Warhammer 40,000, it is genuinely remarkable how often the Tyranids get pushed to the back of the conversation. People talk about chaos with reverence, bordering on obsession. The Necrons have had a massive cultural resurgence. The Tau get their fair share of discourse. But the Tyranids, the species that is, by almost any reasonable measure, the single greatest existential threat not just to the Imperium of man, but to every living thing in the entire Milky Way galaxy, often get treated as a sort of background hum, a recurring invasion force, big bugs that get fought off every few hundred years and then dealt with by heroic space marines. This video is about why that perception is catastrophically wrong. This video is about what the Tyranids actually are, where they came from, what they want, how they fight, and why. If you sit with the full weight of what the lore tells us about them, they are not just one of many threats in the 41st millennium. They are the threat. They are the slow, patient, all-consuming end of everything. An extinction event wearing the face of hunger, and they have already consumed entire galaxies before they even bothered to turn their attention here. So, let's start at the beginning, or as close to a beginning as the lore allows us to get. Because the Tyranids don't have a story in the way other factions do. They don't have a history of ambition, of politics, of betrayal and redemption. Their story is simpler than that, and more terrible for its simplicity. They eat. That is the entire story. Everything else, the bioforms, the hive fleets, the intricate horror of their biology, the cold genius of their invasions, all of it is just the elaborate mechanism by which that single imperative is fulfilled. When Warhammer 40,000 first emerged in 1987 as Rogue Trader, the Tyranids were introduced with relatively little fanfare. They existed as a sort of dangerous alien presence, creepy and dangerous, but not yet the fully realized cosmic horror they would become. It was not until the second edition of the game and the release of Codex Tyranids in 1995 that the faction took on the shape most fans would recognize today. The insectoid aesthetic was pushed further, the Hive Mind was codified, and the three great hive fleets, Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan, entered the lore as distinct, terrifying invasion forces, each one a new way for the galaxy to almost die. Over time, the Tyranids have evolved within the narrative of 40K to occupy a very specific and deeply uncomfortable position. Unlike Chaos, which corrupts and twists and can theoretically be resisted through faith and purity, the Tyranids offer no such recourse. There is no prayer you can say to stop them. Unlike the Necrons, who seek the destruction of biological life but at least operate with recognizable intelligence and can, in rare cases, be negotiated with or outmaneuvered, the Tyranids cannot be reasoned with at any level. They do not understand mercy. They do not understand surrender. They are not even aware of you as an individual in any meaningful sense. To the Tyranid Hive Mind, you are biomass, raw material, fuel for the next wave, and the next wave is always bigger. What makes the Tyranids genuinely, deeply, almost philosophically disturbing, in a way that even Chaos sometimes fails to achieve, is the nature of what they represent. Chaos, for all its horror, is familiar. It grows from the passions and fears and desires of living creatures. It is made of emotion, of ambition, of love and hate twisted into something monstrous. There is a human quality to chaos, even at its most alien. You can understand what Slayanesh wants, even if the wanting of it is nauseating. You can grasp Khorne's appetite for violence, even as you recoil from it. The Tyranids have no such emotional legibility. The Hive Mind is not angry at you, it is not jealous of you, it does not hate you, or love you, or fear you. It is aware of you only in the way that a vast digestive system is aware of the food moving through it. You are noted, processed, consumed. The experience of being faced with that kind of absolute indifference, an intelligence of almost incomprehensible scale that looks at you and your entire civilization and registers nothing but caloric potential. That is the true horror of the Tyranids, not the monsters, not the claws and acid and the endless tide of chitinous bodies. The horror is the silence behind it all, the absence of any malice, because malice would at least mean they care. They don't. They never will. Let's talk about what they are at a biological level, because the biology is essential to understanding everything else. The Tyranids are not a single species in the way humans or Eldar are a single species. They are an extragalactic ecosystem. The Hive fleet is not a fleet in any conventional sense. It is a living biosphere traveling through space, a mobile food chain in which every component serves the larger whole, and the larger whole exists for one purpose: to find biomass and convert it into more of itself. Every creature in the swarm, from the smallest ripper organism, barely larger than a rat, chewing through the wreckage of a battlefield with mindless mechanical efficiency, all the way up to the bio-titans, living siege weapons that stand 30 meters tall and could level a city block with a single sweep of their limbs. Every single one of them is a biological tool grown specifically for a role in the consumption process. They are not born in the way we understand birth. They are manufactured, designed. The Norn queens, vast and terrible matriarchs, nested deep in the hearts of hive ships, process the biomass of consumed worlds and use it as raw material to engineer new organisms, tailored to whatever challenge or environment the swarm currently faces. If a world's defenders use a particularly potent toxin that kills Tyranid creatures, the next generation of organisms sent to that world will have immunity to that toxin. If a planet's atmosphere is hostile to conventional bioforms, new bioforms will be grown that thrive in it. If a defensive line proves impenetrable to the current assault organisms, the Hive Mind adapts and creates new assault organisms designed specifically to break that line. The evolutionary speed of the Tyranids is so extreme that the Magi biologists of Mars have recorded developmental genetic leaps between broods originating from different hive fleets that would take other species millions of years to naturally achieve. The Tyranids can do it in a single generation. This is the engine of the Great Devourer. This is why every victory against the Tyranids carries within it the seed of its own reversal. You beat them once, and in doing so, you teach them how to beat you. Every fallen warrior, every tactic used, every weapon fired, all of it becomes data, absorbed by the Hive Mind, analyzed, and incorporated into the next iteration of the swarm. The Imperium of Man has been fighting the Tyranids across 3 major Tyrannic Wars and is now in the middle of a 4th. And with each war, the enemy they face is smarter, more adaptive, and more precisely calibrated to overcome the defenses they've spent centuries building. That's the world we're stepping into. That's the enemy we're about to explore. The Tyranids also occupy an interesting conceptual space in relation to the other threats of the setting, because of what their existence implies about the galaxy itself. Every other major faction, the Imperium, Chaos, the Necrons, the Eldar, the Orcs, is indigenous to the Milky Way in some sense. They grew here, or were created here, or have been here long enough that the galaxy has shaped them as much as they have shaped it. They are part of the ecosystem. The Tyranids are not. They are an external force, something that crashed into the galaxy from beyond and has no relationship to anything within it except as potential food. This makes them conceptually different from every other threat in a way that matters more than it might initially seem. When the Imperium fights chaos, it is fighting something woven into the fabric of the universe they inhabit, something that has always been there and will always be there. There is a kind of grim permanence to that, but also a kind of comprehensibility. Chaos can be resisted. Its nature, however alien and terrible, can be studied and understood well enough to work against it. When the Imperium fights the Necrons, it is fighting a civilization with history, with politics, with a grudging kind of legibility. The Necrons woke up angry and ancient and lethal, but they are recognizable as having been shaped by the same fundamental processes of existence that shaped everyone else. The Tyranids are not shaped by any of that. They carry with them the biology and the accumulated genetic library of whatever galaxy or galaxies they have consumed before this one. They are not a product of this galaxy's history. They are a force that arrived from outside, with no connection to the events, civilizations, or metaphysical structures that define the 40K universe. And they will not be changed by this galaxy. They will consume it, or they will be stopped, and the galaxy's history is simply irrelevant to either outcome. There is also something worth noting about how the Tyranids relate to the concept of intelligence. They are not unintelligent, far from it. The Hive Mind's tactical sophistication, its ability to plan across star systems and adapt in real time, its understanding of enemy psychology and defensive organization, all of this represents intelligence of a genuinely extraordinary order, but it is intelligence entirely in service of a single directive. There is nothing in the Hive Mind that corresponds to curiosity for its own sake, or to art, or to love, or to any of the things that make intelligence interesting and valuable when we encounter it in the galaxy's other civilizations. It is intelligence perfected and narrowed until it becomes a pure instrument of consumption, and in that narrowing, all the qualities that would make it possible to find common ground or negotiate or even simply to understand it on any human level have been excised. You cannot appeal to the Hive Mind's better nature because it does not have a better nature. You cannot offer it something it wants because it wants only what you are made of. You cannot understand its perspective because its perspective has no room for you as anything other than an ingredient. That is the final, essential nature of the Tyranid threat, and it is what every commander who has faced them and survived eventually comes to understand, usually in the quiet, after a battle when the dead are being counted, and the preparations for the next assault are already underway. The Tyranids are not an enemy in the normal sense of the word. They are an ending, and everything the Imperium does, everything every faction in the galaxy does, is a negotiation with that ending. A struggle to push it further away, to buy more time, to make the ending come later rather than sooner. That struggle is the story of the Tyranid threat. That is what we are going to explore in detail across the rest of this script. If you're enjoying this so far, drop a comment below and let me know what aspect of the Tyranid lore you find most terrifying. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a great time. There's a lot more to unpack here, and we're only just getting started. Section 2. Origin of the Great Devourer, What We Know and What We Fear. The Tyranids do not have an origin story that the Imperium, or anyone else in the galaxy, fully understands. This is not a limitation of the lore. It is, in a very deliberate sense, part of what makes them so deeply unsettling. Other existential threats in Warhammer 40K can be mapped. The Necrons have the War in Heaven, the Chitin, the Great Sleep, the slow awakening of the Tomb Worlds. Chaos has the fall of the Eldar, the birth of Slaanesh, thousands of years of corruption bleeding through the barrier between reality and the warp. Even the Orcs have their prehistoric origin as bioweapons created by the Old Ones in an ancient galactic war. The Tyranids have none of that, at least not from any source the inhabitants of the Milky Way can access. What is known, what the Ordo Xenos, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and every institution that has bothered to seriously study the swarm has been able to piece together, is both simple and staggering. The Tyranids come from outside this galaxy. They are extragalactic. They have traveled through the cold, lightless void between galaxies, a journey that would take other species millions of years, propelled by some biological imperative so deep and so absolute that it might as well be written into the physics of whatever universe they originated in. And here is the part that the most senior members of the Inquisition say only in carefully guarded rooms, away from anyone who might spread the information and cause the kind of panic that collapses planetary governments. The hive fleets that have entered the Milky Way are not the main body. They are not even close to the main body. The tendrils of Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan, each one of which came close to wiping out the Imperium, each one of which consumed entire systems and left behind nothing but barren rocks, are the outriders, the scouts. the leading edge of an invasion fleet so vast that its true scale cannot be meaningfully comprehended. Imagine holding a cup of seawater and being told that the cup you're holding represents the entirety of the threat you've faced so far. Then imagine being told the ocean is still out there. The exact origin point of the Tyranids remains one of the most closely guarded and most genuinely unsettling mysteries in the entire 40K setting. There are theories. The Inquisitor Bronislaw Chevok, one of the few humans to have ever entered the Black Library of the Eldar and emerged with useful intelligence, described the Tyranids as having passed through multiple galaxies before arriving in the Milky Way. He suggested, though he could not prove, that they had already consumed at least one other galaxy, stripped it down to its bones and moved on, their numbers swelling with every world devoured, their genetic library expanding with every species absorbed. They are not an invasive species that wandered into our galaxy by accident. They are the survivors of something older and more terrible, a species honed by millions of years of competition and consumption into the most efficient predators in all known existence. There is a particularly haunting implication embedded in the lore around this. Astronomers and void scholars within the Imperium have long noted certain anomalies in the distant extragalactic void, regions where the light of far galaxies is subtly wrong, where readings suggest vast portions of those galaxies simply produce no biological signatures, no warp presence, nothing that might indicate teeming life. It has been quietly theorized, though never officially confirmed, that what they are looking at are the husks of previously consumed galactic bodies. The Tyranids' wake, the trail they have left behind across the universe, galaxy after galaxy reduced to dead stars and lifeless rocks, the biomass of entire cosmic civilizations, converted into fuel for the next leg of the journey. The question of what drew them to our galaxy specifically is almost as disturbing as the question of where they came from. The most widely accepted theory, and this one has gained significant credence in the modern 40K narrative, is the Astronomicon. The Emperor of mankind, sustained for 10,000 years in a state between life and death on the Golden Throne, blazes like a psychic beacon across the warp, visible across enormous distances of real space by those with the ability to perceive it. For the Imperium, the Astronomicon is a lifeline, the navigational pillar around which all warp travel revolves. For the Tyranids, a species guided by the psychic collective of the Hive Mind, drifting through the intergalactic void in search of biomass-rich targets, that blazing psychic light is not a lifeline. It is a dinner bell. The Emperor's attempt to preserve humanities may have, in a deeply ironic and genuinely tragic way, painted a massive psychic arrow pointing directly at the galaxy's most biomass-dense civilization. The very thing that has allowed humanity to build a galactic empire may have summoned the force most likely to destroy it. Some Inquisitors refuse to accept this theory because accepting it means accepting something too uncomfortable to sit with. That 10,000 years of sacrifice, of maintaining the Golden Throne, of feeding psychers to the Emperor's dying body to keep the Astronomicon burning may have made things worse. That the beacon lighting humanity's way across the stars is also the homing signal guiding an extragalactic predator to their door. Other theories exist. Some savants have pointed to the Pharaohs, an ancient Eldari artifact on the world of Sotha, which was used during the Horus Heresy to guide imperial fleets before it was eventually destroyed. The Pharaohs broadcast a powerful psychic signal that some believe was what first drew the attention of the Tyranids toward this particular region of the universe, pulling their drifting fleet tendrils like moths toward light. Sotha was one of the first worlds consumed by Hive Fleet Kraken, which does lend this theory a grim kind of weight. What none of these theories changes is the fundamental reality. They are here now. Whatever drew them, however far they traveled, the Tyranids have found the Milky Way, and they are not leaving. Or rather, they will not leave until there is nothing left to consume. The Hive Mind does not declare victory and move on to the next galaxy once it has established a foothold. It feeds until the larder is empty, and then it waits, gathers the biomass it has consumed, grows its fleets enormous on the fuel of entire worlds, and moves on in search of more. There is one additional piece of theory, darker than anything else, that deserves mention before we move on. Several Inquisitors and Void Scholars have considered the possibility that the Tyranids did not evolve naturally, even in their galaxy of origin. Their biology is too perfect, too systematically engineered. A species that evolves naturally develops redundancies, vestigial traits, dead ends in its genetic code. The Tyranids show none of this. Every organism serves a precise function. Every bioform is exactly as efficient as it needs to be, and no more. The degree of biological optimization in the Tyranid swarm suggests not evolution but design, and at a level of sophistication that dwarfs anything even the most brilliant minds in the Imperium or among the Eldari could conceive. This raises a question that nobody has been able to answer, and almost nobody is willing to voice. If the Tyranids were designed, who designed them, and why? And are those designers still out there somewhere, drifting through the intergalactic dark, either hunted down and consumed by their own creation, or perhaps watching from some inconceivable distance, waiting to see if the great experiment continues to run as intended? Nobody knows. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that absence of knowledge is itself a kind of horror. There is one more layer to the origin discussion that rarely gets full treatment, and it concerns a concept that the 40K setting handles with unusual restraint: the idea of the Tyranids as a cosmic constant. Other threats can be imagined away. You can construct a scenario where the Emperor recovers, defeats chaos, and humanity survives. You can imagine the Necrons achieving their goal and then reaching some accommodation with the surviving metal shells that remain. Even the orcs, for all their unstoppable nature, are limited by the fact that without something to fight, they eventually fight each other and reduce their numbers. These are threats with edges, with shapes, with theoretical conclusions. The Tyranids have no such edge. They are defined by the lore as effectively infinite in the void, not literally infinite, in the way physics might use that word, but operationally infinite in terms of the resources available to any civilization in this galaxy that might try to count them. The main fleet has not arrived. The tendrils that have pierced the galaxy are described in every source as a fraction, a tiny, almost negligible fraction, of what is coming. If that description is accurate, then even total victory in the Fourth Tyrannic War does not change the fundamental situation. It delays it. Every victory is a delay. Every heroic last stand is a delay. The mathematics of the Tyranid invasion, if the lore's claims about the size of the main fleet are anywhere near accurate, suggest that the Milky Way in its current configuration cannot win against them. It can only slow them down and hope something changes. What might change? The lore offers a few possibilities, none of them entirely satisfying. The Hive Mind could theoretically be disrupted at a sufficiently fundamental level. Certain weapons capable of affecting reality at a warp physics level have been theorized, weapons that might shatter the Hive Mind's synaptic network across a large enough area to cause cascading collapse in swarm coherence. But the engineering requirements for such weapons are beyond anything currently achievable, and the Hive Mind is specifically designed with redundancy in mind. The Silent King's Necron technology offers another path. The Zarakhan dynasty possesses technology capable of suppressing warp activity across vast areas, potentially extending the principle to suppress the synaptic network that holds the swarm together. If the Pariah Nexus, the anti-psychic suppression field the Necrons are building, could be scaled to star system or even sector level, it might sever individual Tyranid organisms from the Hive Mind's direction over wide enough areas to create effective dead zones in the swarm. This is part of what the Silent King is working toward, though the full scope of the plan remains unknown to the factions trying to evaluate it. And then there is the most unorthodox possibility that the Tyranids themselves are the solution to their own problem, in the sense that the Hive Mind's drive to consume everything will eventually consume the very things that make the Milky Way worth consuming, and the fleet will naturally fragment and decline as resources run out. There are Eldari prophecies that speak to something like this. There are mathematical models within the most restricted sections of Ordo Xenos archives that suggest the consumption rate of the swarm cannot be sustained indefinitely without a viable galaxy to consume. But this is cold comfort when the timeline for such a natural decline spans hundreds of thousands of years, and the timescale for total consumption of the galaxy's living inhabitants is considerably shorter than that. The origin question, in the end, points to something that the Tyranid lore does better than almost any other aspect of the 40K setting. It uses the unknown to generate a particular kind of existential dread. The Tyranids do not need a detailed backstory to be terrifying. In fact, they are more terrifying for the absence of one. They are here, they are vast, and the universe before the one they just consumed has already been erased from all records. Nothing remains to study, nothing remains to learn from. The only account of what the Tyranids have done before arriving in the Milky Way is the track of dead galaxies behind them, and the Milky Way cannot read that track because it lacks the instruments and perhaps the courage. What drew them here does not matter anymore. They are here. That is the only relevant fact. Section 3. The Hive Mind and the Shadow in the Warp. To understand the Tyranids, you have to understand the Hive Mind. Not as a concept, not as a game mechanic, but as a genuinely alien form of consciousness that operates on a scale and in a way that has no equivalent anywhere else in the 40K setting, or, for that matter, in human experience. The hive mind is the collective psychic consciousness of the entire Tyranid species. Every Tyranid creature, from the tiniest bacteria breaking down organic matter in a digestion pool, to the Norn queens in the hearts of hive ships, to the bioships themselves slowly processing the void between star systems, is part of a single, continuous, unbroken web of psychic connectivity. There is no individual thought within the swarm. There are no private ambitions, no personal fears, no internal dissent. The hive mind does not deliberate because it does not need to. Its will is expressed instantly and simultaneously across every organism in its reach, updated continuously as conditions change, recalibrated in real time as new information flows in from the billions of sensory organs that serve as its eyes and ears across a battlefield. The closest analogy a human mind can grasp might be to imagine your brain as a separate entity from your body, and your body made up of billions of individual cells, each one performing its assigned function without being individually aware that it is doing so, all of them executing the brain's will with perfect fidelity. Your immune cells don't decide to fight infection. Your heart doesn't choose to beat. They simply do, because the body they are part of has a function, and they fulfill it. The Tyranid hive mind is a brain of effectively infinite scale. Its body is everything. What makes this particularly unsettling from a military standpoint is that the hive mind cannot be disrupted in any conventional way. You cannot assassinate it. You cannot cut its supply lines in the traditional sense. You cannot wait for it to make a strategic blunder born of ego or misunderstanding, because it has neither. Killing a hive tyrant, one of the largest, most powerful synapse creatures on the battlefield, a towering monster that functions as a psychic relay between the hive mind and the lesser creatures around it, does not weaken the hive mind. It merely creates a temporary disruption in local synaptic control, which the hive mind immediately compensates for by routing authority through other nodes. Kill enough synapse creatures fast enough, and the lesser organisms do revert to feral behavior, which is certainly useful in a battle. But the hive mind itself is uninjured. It is simply working around the damage, the way water flows around a stone. The hive mind also has no presence in the warp, in the way that other psychic beings do. The souls of humans and Eldar and other species exist partially in the immaterium, the warp, and this is both their strength and their vulnerability. Chaos reaches them through the warp. Daemonic possession works through the warp. Psychic powers draw from the warp. The Tyranids have no individual souls in this sense. They are cold and empty in the warp. When chaos entities reach out to touch the psychic signature of a Tyranid organism, they find nothing. No soul to corrupt, no emotions to exploit, no desires to twist into chains. The Tyranids are fundamentally immune to everything chaos uses as its primary weapon. But the hive mind is not absent from the warp entirely. It is instead something more dangerous than a simple presence. It generates a phenomenon that the Imperium has come to call the shadow in the warp. The shadow in the warp is the psychic static generated by the hive mind's vast, collective consciousness. Imagine every individual thought of a billion creatures, the combined psychic weight of an entire galaxy-spanning ecosystem, compressed into a single overwhelming signal. Now imagine that signal radiating outward from the hive fleet, washing over every planet and system it approaches. And within that flood of alien noise, every psychic connection, every astropathic communication, every navigator's ability to perceive the warp, every psyker's ability to draw on the immaterium, is drowned, smothered, silenced. For a civilization as dependent on psychic communication and warp travel as the Imperium, this is catastrophic in a way that goes beyond the physical damage of the swarm itself. Astropaths are the only means by which worlds separated by light years can communicate in anything less than geological time frames. The Astronomicon is the only reliable means of navigating the warp. When the shadow falls, both of these become unavailable. Worlds go silent, cut off from the broader network of the Imperium, unable to call for reinforcements, unable even to confirm that other worlds still exist. Ships attempting to travel through the warp in shadow-affected space find the experience deeply traumatic, with some navigators driven permanently insane by the attempt to feel their way through a psychic maelstrom of alien noise. And the worst part, the part that makes military planners wake up at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of their quarters in cold sweat, is that the shadow falls before the physical invasion begins. You do not feel the shadow when the bioships appear in your system. You feel the shadow days, sometimes weeks before they arrive. By the time the swarm descends on your world, you have already been isolated. You have already been cut off. Your calls for help have already gone unanswered, not because nobody cares, but because nobody even knows you're screaming. There is something viscerally awful about that. To face the most terrible enemy in the galaxy in total isolation, knowing that every message you send is dissolving into the alien noise of the hive mind, knowing that the Imperium's response forces, if any are even coming, have no way to navigate accurately through the static, knowing you are alone in a way that goes beyond geography into something more absolute. The shadow in the warp doesn't just cut communications. It affects the minds of beings on the affected worlds directly. Psychers within its range experience the alien noise of the hive mind as a physical sensation, a scratching, scraping, all-pervasive wrongness that presses against the inside of their skulls. Those who lack the mental fortitude to resist begin to break down, repeating phrases in a language that no human tongue was built to speak, phrases that are not transmitted to them but that somehow bleed through from the hive mind simply through proximity to its enormity. Ordinary people feel it too, though less specifically, as a creeping dread, a primal wrongness, an animal certainty that they are prey. Entire populations have been found in states of paralytic terror hours before the first Tyranid organism made landfall, not because they saw anything coming, but because they felt the shadow pressing down, and some part of their ancient animal brain recognized it for what it was: the ending of a world. There is also the deeper implication of the hive mind that rarely gets discussed: what it means for the Tyranids' ability to learn and improve. Every engagement with any force in the galaxy, every battle, every tactic used against them, every weapon that kills them or fails to kill them, all of this data flows back through the synapse network to the hive mind, which stores it, analyzes it, and uses it to engineer better organisms for the next encounter. The Tyranids fought the Blood Angels at the devastation of Baal and were eventually driven back. But the hive mind learned from every moment of that battle, every tactical decision Commander Dante made, every weapon the Blood Angels deployed, every moment of vulnerability in the Tyranid assault that was exploited. All of it has been absorbed and will be accounted for the next time the Tyranids face a similar situation. This is why veteran Tyranid hunters speak with genuine dread about the experience of facing a hive fleet that has already consumed part of the Eldar, or fought extensively against the Tau. Each new enemy they consume or fight enriches the genetic and tactical library of the hive mind. The Tyranids that attack a world defended by Space Marines in M42 are drawing on thousands of years of accumulated intelligence about how Space Marines fight, how they think, what their vulnerabilities are. They are not learning in real time on the battlefield. They have already learned, and what you face is the finished product of that learning. There is also something profound and alarming about how the hive mind interfaces with the concept of death and defeat. Every major faction in the 40K setting that suffers a significant defeat is weakened by it, at least temporarily. An orc warband that loses its warboss descends into infighting. An Imperial Guard regiment that loses its officer corps becomes ineffective until reorganized. A Chaos warband that fails to take a world might scatter to pursue other opportunities. These are all limitations born from the fact that their factions are made up of individuals with personal survival instincts, personal loyalties, personal reasons to decide the mission is no longer worth dying for. The Hive Mind has none of these limitations. When a Tyranid force suffers catastrophic casualties, the Hive Mind does not mourn. It does not retreat to reconsider. It does not lose confidence. It simply incorporates the data of the defeat, identifies the vectors through which the losses occurred, and designs the next wave to address them. A billion dead Hormagaunts is not a tragedy. It is a research exercise. The Hive Mind tests its organisms against the enemy, the same way a biologist tests compounds against bacteria, methodically, without attachment to any individual result, interested only in the data that will inform the next iteration. This means that fights against Tyranids, which result in heavy Tyranid casualties, are not necessarily victories in any meaningful strategic sense. You killed many of them, and they did not kill many of you. Good. But in killing those Tyranids, you demonstrated the weapon, the tactic, the defensive configuration that made that kill rate possible, and you demonstrated it to a mind that never forgets and never stops thinking about how to overcome what it just observed. You taught the enemy your best trick, and the enemy has a classroom that spans a galaxy and a memory that spans millions of years. Perhaps most interesting of all is the question of what the Hive Mind is, metaphysically, in the warp. The warp in 40K is the repository of psychic energy, the immaterium, the realm of emotion and consciousness, the place where thoughts and feelings generate real power. The Chaos Gods are formed from the accumulated psychic weight of the galaxy's species, given shape by the intensity of emotion that feeds them. In theory, something like the Tyranid Hive Mind, an entity of such extraordinary psychic scale, representing the combined consciousness of trillions of organisms, should have a significant warp presence of its own. It does, in a sense, but it is not a presence the way the Chaos Gods are a presence. The Hive Mind appears in the warp as a vast, cold, lightless weight, not the blazing emotional fire of chaos, but a crushing pressure like the deep ocean. It does not generate the kind of warp presence that chaos entities can grab onto or use, because it is not made of emotion. It is made of purpose. And purpose, in the architecture of the warp, is apparently much harder to manipulate than feeling. Some of the most senior inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos believe that the Hive Mind's warp presence is actually growing as it consumes more of the galaxy, that with each world stripped of its biomass and its billions of souls absorbed into the consuming indifference of the swarm, the absence those souls leave behind in the warp accumulates into a kind of negative space, a void in the immaterium that slowly erases the psychic traces of everything the Tyranids destroy. If this theory is correct, then a fully successful Tyranid invasion of the Milky Way would not just physically consume the galaxy's life, it would erase it from the warp as well. Every person who has ever lived, every civilization that has ever risen and fallen, every psychic echo that persists in the immaterium of 10,000 years of human history, and the even older histories of the Eldar and Necrons, all of it would be consumed alongside the physical matter, leaving behind a warp that is quieter, emptier, and colder than it has ever been. The Chaos Gods fear this. The concept of their food source being systematically eliminated, of the emotional fuel that sustains them being replaced by an advancing cold void, is one of the few things in the 40K setting that genuinely threatens the Dark God's power. A galaxy consumed by the Tyranids is a galaxy where chaos starves, and the Dark Gods, for all their incomprehensible power, are not immune to hunger in their own way. Section 4. The Anatomy of an Invasion, How They Devour Worlds. The consumption of a world by a Tyranid hive fleet is not an event. It is a process, and it is a process of almost appalling biological elegance when you can bring yourself to examine it without flinching. From the first scouting organisms to the final grinding silence of complete consumption, a Tyranid planetary invasion follows a pattern that has been refined across millions of years and countless conquered worlds. Every stage exists for a reason. Every stage feeds into the next. It begins long before any physical presence is detected. The first stage of a Tyranid invasion is infiltration, and the primary instruments of infiltration are organisms called lictors. A lictor is a solitary hunter, built for stealth in a way that most Tyranid organisms are not. Where the standard image of the Tyranid swarm is an overwhelming tide of bodies, the lictor is something else entirely, a single creature, roughly the size of a large human but infinitely more dangerous, capable of concealing itself in almost any environment through a combination of color-shifting skin and pheromone-masking adaptations that make it effectively invisible to both technological and psychic detection. Lictors are dropped ahead of the main invasion, sometimes months or even years in advance. Their purpose is reconnaissance. They infiltrate a world's population centers, its military installations, its most heavily defended positions, and they observe. They catalog every defensive emplacement, every forced deployment, every potential vulnerability. They detect the psychic signatures of psychers and relay that intelligence back to the Hive Mind. And then they wait, patient and silent, until the shadow falls and the invasion begins in earnest. Once the main swarm arrives, the Lictor's pheromone trail serves as a navigational guide, drawing larger organisms to the weak points that have been identified over months of careful observation. The second stage is the arrival of the biofleet itself. The hive ships are among the most massive living creatures in existence, organic vessels of almost inconceivable size, moving through space using biological propulsion systems. They are not merely transport vessels, they are the ecosystem. Within their vast interiors, Norn queens gestate billions of organisms in fluid-filled chambers, drawing on stored biomass to fuel constant production. The ships are armed with bioweapons, living organisms that fire organic projectiles, or that project fields of corrosive spores, or that function as living gun emplacements built into the ship's body. The hive ship does not carry weapons. The hive ship is a weapon. When the fleet arrives in orbit, the shadow falls. As established in the previous section, communication collapses, and then the orbital bombardment begins. Mycetic spores, enormous, leathery pods grown in the birthing chambers of hive ships, rain down through the atmosphere, each one containing creatures designed for the opening phases of combat. Spore mines drift on the wind, detonating against anything that passes close enough. Gargoyles fill the sky, winged organisms that provide aerial cover for the swarm below. Hormagaunts, fast and brutal close assault organisms with 4 scything limbs and a complete absence of anything resembling fear, pour across the ground in tides so thick they cover the landscape like a living carpet. The defenders fire into the masses, and the masses absorb the casualties without slowing. Every Tyranid that dies on the approach is noted by the Hive Mind and factored into the calculation. If too many die to a particular weapon system, the next wave will be adapted to resist it. If the defenders hold a line, the swarm simply flows around it, cutting off supply routes and communication, waiting until the defenders exhaust their ammunition and begin to falter. Synapse creatures direct the battle from within the swarm. Hive tyrants tower above the lesser organisms, psychically relay the hive mind's will down through the chain of command, and personally engage the most dangerous enemy combatants. Where they stand, the swarm fights with terrifying coordination, each individual organism acting as an extension of a single tactical intelligence, adapting in real time to the evolving situation. As the battle progresses, the planet's surface is systematically broken down. Ripper organisms, released in the billions, once enemy resistance begins to collapse, devour everything organic they encounter: human bodies, animal corpses, vegetation, bacterial colonies in the soil. What they consume, they regurgitate into digestion pools, vast chemical vats that form on the planet's surface, and begin breaking down the raw material into nutrient slurry. From these pools rise capillary towers, living organic structures that grow from the ground upward, like enormous ribbed spines, reaching toward orbit, pumping the processed biomass up to the waiting hive ships in streams of dense biological material. By the time this process is complete, there is nothing left. Not a tree, not a microorganism in a pool of water, not a bacterium in the soil. The planet's oceans are chemical wastelands. Its atmosphere is toxic, stripped of anything useful. It is a rock in space, and the hive fleet is already turning its attention to the next target, its hold swollen with the fuel of everything that once lived and breathed and moved on the world below. One of the most disturbing details of this process is what happens to the Tyranid organisms once the consumption is complete. Even the creatures used in the invasion are not saved. When a world is harvested, the Rippers devour the bodies of fallen Tyranid warriors as readily as they devour the bodies of the defenders. The hive ships draw down the Norn queens and their spawning pools, absorbing even the birthing structures. Nothing is wasted. The Tyranids that fought and died for the hive fleet are themselves digested and recycled into biomass, their matter redistributed to fuel the creation of the next generation of organisms. There is no burial for Tyranid warriors. There is no memorial. There is only the cycle. This also means that the hive fleet grows with every world it consumes. A tendril that begins with sufficient force to consume a small agri-world will, after that consumption, have sufficient biomass to produce an invasion force capable of taking on a more heavily defended industrial world. That world's biomass will be used to produce a force capable of challenging a fortified hive world. The mathematics of the Tyranid invasion is a biological accelerant. Each success feeds directly into the capacity for a larger success. The only way to truly stop a hive fleet is to starve it, and starving it requires withholding the very planets it seeks to consume, which means burning your own worlds before the swarm can take them. Some Inquisitors have ordered exactly this. We'll get to that story in due course. Understanding this process also illuminates why even a tactical victory against the Tyranids so often feels hollow. You hold a world, you repel the swarm, and in the process you have perhaps used every heavy weapon available, burned through ammunition stockpiles built up over decades, sacrificed thousands of soldiers, and depleted the strategic reserve that was meant to protect 3 other systems. The Hive Mind, meanwhile, has gathered extensive data on your defensive capabilities, absorbed the genetic material of every Tyranid organism that died on your surface, and is already beginning the process of designing a new generation of creatures specifically calibrated to break through the defense that just proved successful. You won, and in winning, you made the enemy stronger. There is one additional dimension of the invasion process that deserves extended attention because it rarely gets discussed with the weight it deserves: the effect on the human beings who survive. The populations of worlds that have been attacked by Tyranid invasions, those that managed to resist, those that were evacuated in time, those on neighboring worlds who received refugees and accounts from the survivors, are not simply traumatized in the ordinary way that military defeat and civilian suffering traumatize people. They carry something more specific and more difficult to treat. Survivors of Tyranid attacks describe a particular quality to their experience that distinguishes it from survival of other conflicts. In wars against chaos, survivors often describe corruption, temptation, the horror of seeing others changed. In battles against the orcs, there is the brutality and the chaotic violence, but there is also a kind of recognizable aggression, something that operates on principles they can understand even while hating them. Survivors of Tyranid attacks describe the absence of recognition, the absence of any sense that the enemy saw them as anything. They were in the path of the swarm. The swarm moved over them, or through them, or stopped before reaching them by chance. There was no malice, and there was no mercy, and there was no acknowledgement of their existence. There was only the tide, and the tide does not see you. The psychological impact of being attacked by something that simply does not perceive you as an individual, that does not register your fear or your courage or your defiance as anything other than irrelevant chemical signals from a source of biomass, has been described by Ordo Xenos attached psychers as producing a unique form of what the Adeptus Sororitas medical texts call soul wound, a deep structural disruption in the survivor's sense of their own significance. The Chaos Worshipper believes you matter enough to corrupt. The Orc believes you matter enough to fight. The Tyranid does not believe you matter at all, and surviving something that considers you inconsequential rather than worth killing does something specific and lasting to a person's sense of self. This is also why Tyranid-affected populations are often more politically unstable in the aftermath than populations that survived other alien attacks. The Genestealer cult presence, discussed in a later section, takes root most easily in communities that have already been touched by Tyranid proximity, not because the genetic infection spreads automatically, but because the psychological vulnerability created by the encounter makes the cult's offer of meaning and belonging and cosmic significance particularly powerful. People who have experienced the existential flatness of a Tyranid attack, who have felt, at the cellular level, that they are nothing to the universe, are precisely the people most susceptible to a secret brotherhood telling them they are chosen, that they are beloved by star gods, that their suffering has purpose. The Tyranids create, in passing, the perfect conditions for their own future invasions. Section 5. The Genestealer Vanguard, Seeds of Ruin. If the invasion process described in the last section is the main event, then the Genestealer cult is the opening act that nobody sees coming. And it is, in many ways, the most terrifying component of the entire Tyranid threat, because it operates not in the open, not in the sky, not in the streets as a wave of monsters, but in the dark, in the spaces between respectable society, in the hearts and minds of ordinary people who have no idea they are being used as the instruments of their own civilization's destruction. Genestealers are among the oldest Tyranid organisms encountered by the Imperium. In fact, long before the lore established them as the vanguard of the Hive fleets, they were encountered independently on space hulks, those vast, drifting conglomerations of fused starships that tumble through the warp and emerge into real space, carrying whatever horrors have accumulated within them over the centuries. The game Space Hulk, first released in 1989, predates any codified understanding of what Genestealers actually are. The Space Marines fighting through the dark corridors of those derelict vessels had no idea they were facing the advanced scouts of an extragalactic predator. They thought they were dealing with a dangerous Xenos creature, terrifying but contained. They were wrong. A Genestealer, encountered alone, is already an extremely dangerous organism. It stands roughly the height of a tall human, though the proportions are all wrong. Too many limbs, each one ending in razor-edged blades of chitin that can part ceramite armor with casual force. A second pair of arms tucked closer to the body. Eyes that catch light in the dark in a way that suggests an entirely different visual spectrum being utilized. And a speed and agility that makes it look when it moves, as though the rules of physics are being applied selectively to its advantage. They are predators of extraordinary lethality, and a single pure-strain Genestealer encountering an unprepared colony or isolated outpost is already a catastrophe. But Genestealers do not need to kill everything they touch. They can do something far worse. The Genestealer Kiss, as it has been grimly termed by the Ordo Xenos, is the mechanism by which a single Genestealer can convert an isolated encounter into the beginning of the end for an entire world. When a Genestealer chooses not to kill a victim, it implants them with its genetic material through a biological process that rewrites a portion of the victim's genetic code. The victim survives, and they are not immediately physically changed. They look human, act human, live their life in what appears to be a normal fashion, except for two things. First, they are now psychically bound to the Genestealer that infected them, and through it, to the growing network of the Broodmind, a localized echo of the Hive Mind, built from the collective psychic weight of the Genestealer population on a given world. Their loyalty is absolute. Not the loyalty of soldiers, not the loyalty of citizens who have been reasoned with or threatened. The loyalty of organisms that have been biologically rewired so that serving the Patriarch, the eldest and most powerful Genestealer who leads the cult, is as fundamental to their identity as the desire to breathe. Second, their children are hybrids. The genetic material implanted by the Genestealer expresses itself in the next generation, producing first-generation hybrids who are unmistakably alien in their appearance. Extra limbs, chitin plating beneath the skin, eyes that glow with a pale light. These first-generation hybrids cannot walk freely in human society without raising immediate, dangerous attention. They are kept hidden. Second-generation hybrids are slightly more human in appearance. Third-generation hybrids can sometimes pass with careful management of their alien features. By the fourth generation, the hybrids are nearly indistinguishable from baseline humans, capable of walking through the corridors of an Imperial Hive city without attracting a second glance. And then those fourth-generation humans produce pure-strain Genestealers again, and the cycle begins anew. Over the course of decades or even centuries, a Genestealer cult grows through the fabric of a society like mycelium through soil, invisible, spreading, patient. It recruits preferentially from the margins of society, from the underbelly of hive cities where conditions are desperate, and the comforting narrative of a secret brotherhood with sacred purpose has genuine appeal. The cult presents itself as a religious organization, a fraternal order, a community of the faithful awaiting the coming of the Star Children, their term for the Hive fleet that will one day arrive to receive them. They genuinely believe they are chosen, that they are beloved, that their suffering has meaning and their devotion will be rewarded. The reward, of course, is being devoured alongside everything else when the fleet arrives. But the cult doesn't know that, or more precisely, the psychic influence of the broodmind shapes how they understand their fate. The consumed and the consumed become one in the body of the swarm. There is a terrible beauty to the delusion. In the same way, there is a terrible beauty to any true believer walking calmly toward their end. As the cult grows in size and influence, it begins to infiltrate every level of its host society. Into the military, where hybrid officers can misroute troop deployments, sabotage weapon systems, or ensure that the right reports never reach the right people. Into the political structures, where hybrid administrators can quietly redirect resources, manipulate trade routes, undermine the morale-maintaining structures of imperial governance. Into the religious orders, where the cult's framework as a devotional practice gives it legitimate cover for gathering its members and conducting its rites in plain sight. When the Hive fleet draws near, its approach signaled to the Patriarch by the growing strength of the Broodmind's beacon, the cult erupts. Carefully positioned members rise simultaneously across the world in coordinated strikes against key infrastructure. Defense systems go offline. Communication hubs fall silent. The garrison forces that might have repelled an invasion find themselves fighting a revolt on their own streets while the shadow falls over the sky and the first mycetic spores begin their descent. By the time the swarm lands, the world is already half broken, its defenders divided and exhausted, its command structure riddled with traitors. The Tyranids did not just attack this world, they spent a generation preparing it to fall. And the people who were used in that preparation, infected, manipulated, weaponized, never had any choice in the matter. They were tools, as surely as the hormagaunts that followed them into the rubble of the civilization they helped to destroy. It is worth sitting with the moral dimension of the Genestealer cult phenomenon, because it is one of the genuinely unusual ethical spaces the 40K setting creates. The hybrid members of a Genestealer cult, the second and third generation hybrids who grew up within the cult, who have been shaped by it from birth, cannot be meaningfully blamed for what they are. They were made this way. The Genestealer's kiss removed their parents' ability to choose, and the children of that choice were never given one. They are alien in their biology, fanatical in their devotion, and utterly convinced that the destruction of their civilization is actually salvation. They die in the advancing swarm's first wave with the absolute certainty that they are passing into the embrace of their divine star children. And they are wrong, in the most absolute and final way possible. The swarm does not distinguish the cultists from the rest of the world's population. To the hive mind, a hybrid's biomass is just as useful as a guardsman's biomass. The cult that spent decades preparing the world for consumption will be consumed alongside everyone else, with no recognition that they served, no reward for their loyalty, no acknowledgement that they existed at all. The Genestealer cult is perhaps the most complete expression of the Tyranids' absolute indifference to everything but the consumption imperative. They will use living beings as tools and discard them without a second thought, not even out of cruelty, but simply because cruelty would require caring about the tool's experience. The Inquisition's response to confirmed Genestealer cult activity on a world is, consequently, one of the most brutal standard practices in an institution not known for its softness. Confirmed infection requires immediate quarantine and, in most cases, exterminatus if the infection has spread beyond the ability of conventional forces to contain. Not because the infected individuals are considered enemies in a political sense, but because they are carrying the genetic signature that the hive mind reads as a beacon. And as long as that beacon exists on the surface of the world is drawing the hive fleet toward it. The cold logic of the Inquisition's response, burn the world before it becomes a beacon, is fundamentally sound given the nature of the threat, and fundamentally horrifying given that the people being burned are mostly ordinary citizens who have no idea what is living in their neighborhood. There are also documented cases of Genestealer cults that became aware, at some level, of what the Hive fleet's arrival would actually mean for them. Accounts from inquisitorial interrogations of captured higher generation hybrids reveal that some of them understood the end was consumption rather than salvation. Some continued their work anyway, driven by the broodmind's compulsion beyond any ability to resist. Others showed signs of genuine psychological disintegration. The horror of knowing you are engineering the death of everyone around you, including yourself, and being biologically unable to stop. These cases, rare as they are, represent perhaps the most human-legible tragedy the Tyranid invasion produces. People trapped by their biology, knowing exactly what they are doing and exactly what it will cost them, and doing it anyway because the hive mind is stronger than any individual will. In a setting where the Imperium regularly commits atrocities in the name of survival, and where chaos turns people into monsters, and where war is the constant state of existence, the quiet tragedy of the infected human who cannot choose otherwise is a particularly affecting note. Section 6. Hive Fleet Behemoth, the First Tyrannic War. In the year 745 of the 41st millennium, the eastern fringe of the galaxy encountered something it had no framework to understand. Star systems began going silent, not the silence of communication failures or bureaucratic delay, which were regrettably common in the Imperium, but the sudden, total, absolute silence of worlds that had simply stopped. The first readings suggested nothing unusual, no fleet activity, no signs of conflict, just silence, spreading outward like a stain in water, system by system, each one going dark in sequence. The world of Tyran was the first major Imperial installation to fall. The listening post there, staffed by trained Adeptus Mechanicus observers, managed to transmit a single, fragmentary data packet before it went offline. The transmission described an entity of previously unrecorded biological diversity, moving through space in what appeared to be a cloud of living ships. The data packet contained genetic analysis of several recovered organisms, each one unlike anything in the Imperium's vast biological databases, and a brief, incomplete visual record of the swarm descending toward Tyran's surface. After that, nothing. The world of Tyran was consumed so completely that the follow-up expedition, arriving weeks later, found a planet stripped of every organic molecule. The buildings had been partially dissolved. The equipment of the listening station had been incorporated into digestion pools. There were no bodies, because the bodies had become biomass. The entity was given a name, Hive Fleet Behemoth. Behemoth's invasion strategy was direct, almost brutally simple. Where later hive fleets would demonstrate the kind of adaptive, multi-directional complexity that made them so difficult to contain, Behemoth was a battering ram. It assembled its forces into a concentrated mass and drove them along a single vector with tremendous force, consuming everything in its path and using the biomass of each consumed world to feed the next wave. Its trajectory was an arrow aimed directly at Macragge, homeworld of the Ultramarines chapter. What is interesting about Behemoth's approach in retrospect is how it demonstrates the hive mind learning curve. Behemoth's strategy was simple because it was, in a sense, the first probe, a first contact assault on a new galaxy, testing what resistance looked like, what the defenders were capable of, what kinds of fortifications and weapons and tactics the inhabitants of this galaxy brought to bear against the swarm. A battering ram approach might be wasteful of resources and ultimately beatable, but it generates maximum data on the enemy's response under the most direct possible pressure. You learn more about how a door is built by ramming it repeatedly than by analyzing it from a distance. Everything Behemoth taught the hive mind about how the Imperium defends its worlds, the orbital platform configurations, the defensive doctrines, the willingness to sacrifice individual planets to protect key assets, the role of Space Marine chapters as rapid response forces. All of that knowledge shaped every subsequent invasion. Kraken's multi-tendril approach was a direct adaptation based on lessons learned from Behemoth's defeat. Leviathan's below-the-galactic plane attack vector was a further adaptation, addressing the systematic flaw in Imperial defensive orientation that Kraken had identified. You do not teach the Tyranids. They take lessons from you without your permission, and they do not pay for the education with anything you want. The Ultramarines, led by their chapter master Marneus Calgar, recognized what was coming and prepared Macragge's already formidable defenses with every resource at their disposal. Orbital platforms were brought to full readiness. The entire chapter was deployed. Battle fleets of the Imperial Navy were summoned to the defense. Multiple Space Marine chapters sent contingents to assist, and still, the numbers were staggering. The bioships of Behemoth arrived in such quantity that they literally blocked out the light of local stars when viewed from Macragge's surface, a darkness that fell over the world like a physical weight. The battle in orbit was devastating. The Imperial Navy threw itself against the incoming biofleet with calculated violence. Nuclear-tipped warheads detonated among clusters of bioships, tearing through living hulls and spilling the organisms within them into the void. But Behemoth simply had too many ships. For every biovessel destroyed, 3 more closed the gap, and the smaller escort organisms swarmed around Imperial cruisers and living nets that tore at their hulls and drained their weapons fire on screens of expendable bodies. The orbital engagement was a Pyrrhic defense at best. The Imperial Navy inflicted enormous casualties, but the price of those casualties was the near destruction of the defending fleet. On the ground, the defense of Macragge became one of the most celebrated and costly actions in Ultramarines history. The polar fortresses, immense bastions built into the very rock of Macragge's Arctic regions, armed with weapons designed to level continents, became the last line of defense for the chapter's mortal population and its most sacred relics. The first company of the Ultramarines, the chapter's elite Terminators, was deployed to defend these fortresses. Their sacrifice defined the battle. The Swarm Lord, a creature we will discuss in considerably more detail later, but for now, understand it as the Hive Mind's most powerful and individual instrument of destruction, a unique bioform that has existed since the beginning of the Tyranid species and cannot be permanently killed, was deployed to break the polar fortresses. The Swarm Lord directed the assault on the fortresses with a tactical intelligence that negated every defensive advantage the Ultramarines had built, adapting to each countermeasure in real time. The first company held for as long as any mortal force could hold, but in the end, the weight of the swarm and the Swarm Lord's direction were too much. The entire first company was killed to the last warrior defending those fortresses, their bodies dragged into the digestion pools along with everything else. Calgar himself faced the Swarm Lord in direct combat and came as close to death as any chapter master has come and survived. His honor guard died around him. His armor was shredded. He survived only through a combination of his extraordinary resilience and the timely intervention of reserves, and even then, the Swarm Lord was not fully destroyed, merely wounded enough to retreat. The salvation of Macragge came not from the ground, but from space. Combined battle fleets of the Imperial Navy, the White Scars chapter, and reinforcing Ultramarines elements struck at the Behemoth fleet in a coordinated assault that finally broke the biofleet's coherence. Without orbital support, without the constant rain of mycetic spores, the ground forces already deployed began to be cut off and isolated. The Tyranids on the surface fought with undiminished ferocity, as they always do, but they could no longer be reinforced, and eventually the weight of Imperial arms ground them down. Hive Fleet Behemoth was shattered, the remaining bioships scattered in multiple directions, some entering sublight flight to survive as splinter fleets, others destroyed in pursuit. The battle was declared a victory, but the price was enormous. Macragge's surface was scarred beyond easy repair. The polar fortresses were ruins. The Ultramarines' first company no longer existed, and the world's Behemoth had consumed along its path Tyran, Prondium, the paradise world of Calth, were dead husks, stripped of every molecule of life. Entire civilizations, hundreds of millions of people, simply gone. Converted into fuel for a fleet that was then destroyed before it could fully accomplish its purpose. The world of Prandium deserves its own moment of quiet grief in this account. It had been a paradise world, one of the most fertile and beautiful in the Ultramarines' territory, a world of rich farmland and vibrant cities, its population numbering in the hundreds of millions. The Tyranid assault on Prondium lasted perhaps a week before the world was stripped bare. A week. Not because the defenders gave up, but because the numbers were simply incomprehensible. Prandium's ground forces fought until their ammunition was gone, their vehicles were melted under acid-spitting organisms, and the last defenders were overwhelmed in direct combat. Then the Rippers came, and after the Rippers came the Capillary Towers, and after the Capillary Towers came the silence that had once been a living world. The Ultramarines remember Prandium. They keep the records of what was lost. And the deliberate choice to remember, to maintain the names of the dead, to record the population counts of consumed worlds, to refuse to allow the Tyranid invasion, to erase not just the physical reality of what it destroyed, but the memory of it, is one of the quiet human resistances the Imperium musters against the Great Devourer. The Tyranids consume biomass. They do not consume memory. As long as someone remembers what was there, something of it survives. The Imperium looked at the aftermath of the First Tyrannic War and allowed itself a dangerous, comfortable lie, that Behemoth was the extent of the Tyranid threat, that the silence of the Eastern Fringe before the invasion had been the preparation of a single fleet, and that fleet was now gone. The Administratum began suggesting that the military presence maintained on the southeastern fringe was no longer necessary, that the resources could be redirected, that the threat was over. It was not over. It was never over. It had barely begun. Section 7, Hive Fleet Kraken, the Second Tyrannic War. 250 years passed. In the scale of history, that sounds like a long time. In the time scale of a galaxy-spanning civilization, it is nothing. The Imperium rebuilt, replenished its losses, and the fear of Behemoth faded into history, still honored, still remembered, but increasingly treated as a singular catastrophe rather than the opening move of something vastly larger. Then worlds began to go silent again. In the year 992 of the 41st millennium, the second great Tyranid invasion hit the galaxy. Where Behemoth had been a single concentrated force driving along one vector, Hive Fleet Kraken was something fundamentally different in its approach. And that difference made it, in some ways, even more dangerous. Kraken spread itself into hundreds of simultaneous tendrils, each one striking at different worlds across a vast front, each one capable of independent action under the direction of the Hive Mind, each one consuming biomass and growing as it went, making the Hive fleet as a whole impossible to defeat in the decisive single engagement that had ultimately stopped Behemoth. You cannot cut off the head of Kraken because Kraken does not have a single head. It has 1,000, and cutting off any number of them does not stop the rest. This strategy was not random. It was the Hive Mind adapting. Behemoth's defeat had been caused by its concentration. A concentrated force could be met with a concentrated defense, and once that defense broke the fleet's cohesion, the scattered remnants could be hunted down individually. Kraken's multi-tendril approach made that kind of decisive engagement nearly impossible. The Imperium could not be at 100 places at once, and Kraken knew it. The Hive fleet struck where the defenses were thinnest, swept through systems before reinforcements could arrive, and used the biomass of each consumed world to regenerate and redirect the consuming tendril toward the next target. Among the first worlds known to be consumed by Kraken were Sothi, the world already mentioned as the possible site of the Pharaoh's Beacon, along with Maral, Graia, and Rodnar. The fall of Sotha was particularly significant because it was the homeworld of the Scythes of the Emperor chapter. The Scythes were essentially annihilated as a coherent fighting force in the defense of their home, reduced from a full chapter of roughly 1,000 warriors to a tiny remnant. They survived, but barely, and the loss of Sotha, along with the pharaohs, removed one of the most powerful psychic artifacts of the Imperium from the galaxy. The cunning aspect of Kraken's early advance was a detail that the Inquisition only uncovered later, with considerable horror. The worlds along the eastern fringe that seemed to be descending into rebellion, terrorism, and civil unrest in the period leading up to the outbreak of the Second Tyrannic War, the worlds where populations seemed to be growing restless, where there were riots and sabotage and general social breakdown, were not experiencing independent political crises. They were experiencing Genestealer cult activations. Kraken's advance guard had been in place for years, seeding worlds with cults that activated in a coordinated sequence, weakening defenses from within, just as the swarm arrived from without. The Administratum officials who had been arguing that the Eastern military presence was unnecessary and that the populations were merely discontented, investigation by the Inquisition established that all of them had either originated in the southeastern region or had traveled there within a suspicious window of time. They had been infected. They had been placed in positions of influence and were performing their function with the absolute fidelity of organisms that had been biologically reprogrammed to serve the swarm. The Second Tyrannic War burned across the eastern fringe with terrible speed. The multi-tendril nature of Kraken made coordination of the Imperial response nightmarishly difficult, Every time a force was assembled to repel one tendril, two others struck elsewhere. Every world consumed added to the momentum. The Tau Empire, for once finding itself on the same side as the Imperium, in at least the broadest sense, launched its own defensive campaigns against tendrils of Kraken that threatened Tau space, though with characteristically pragmatic self-interest rather than any genuine alliance. There are accounts from this period, survivor testimonies gathered by the Ordo Xenos, that describe a particular quality to Kraken's assault that Behemoth had not shown. Where Behemoth's organisms had been powerful and numerous, but tactically somewhat blunt, Kraken's swarm showed a different level of operational subtlety. Individual tendrils would advance and pull back, not in the way a military force pulls back to conserve resources or maintain a defensive line, but in the way a predator tests the edges of a defensive perimeter, probing for the weak points, then driving hard and fast when one is found. Commanders who thought they understood Tyranid tactics from Behemoth found that Kraken behaved differently, and the adjustment period, the period when they were developing new counter-strategies, cost worlds and lives. This is the learning dynamic in action. Behemoth taught the Hive Mind what the Imperium's defensive response looked like. Kraken applied that knowledge in the design of a more effective approach. The Imperium, having barely adjusted to Behemoth, was not prepared for a fundamentally different tactical philosophy. The most famous engagement of the Second Tyrannic War was the Battle of Iyanden. The assault by a massive Kraken tendril on craft-world Iyanden, one of the great Aeldari world ships, a vessel carrying the last remnants of entire Aeldari civilizations and the souls of their ancestors in the spirit stones embedded in its walls. Iyanden was struck by a force of such scale that the Aeldari defenders were reduced to bringing their honored dead, souls inhabiting the ghost metal bodies of Wraith Lords and Wraith Blades, to bear in the defense of the living. Entire sections of the craft world were consumed or destroyed. The butcher's bill for Iyanden was almost beyond recovery, but the Aeldari are not the Imperium, and their ability to mobilize psychic power and defense is considerable even against the shadow in the warp. Iyanden survived, barely, at a cost that the survivors describe as existential, not just in lives, but in the continuity of their civilization. The spirit stones shattered in the Tyranid assault were not just decorations or cultural artifacts. Each one contained the soul of an Aeldari who had died, preserved from the consuming darkness of chaos by being caught in the stone's crystalline matrix. When those stones were shattered, those souls were not simply lost. They were unmoored from their protection and exposed to the warp in the moment of the stone's destruction. Some may have been consumed by chaos entities in that instant. Some may have simply ceased to exist. For the Aeldari, whose species' survival is already hanging by a thread, the loss was not just numbers. It was irreversible damage to the continuity of who they are as a people. There is a particular cruelty to the fact that the Tyranids could not have cared less. They did not understand what they were destroying when they shattered those spirit stones. They did not know or care about the irreplaceable nature of what they consumed. It was just mass. The decisive turn of the Second Tyrannic War came at Ichar IV. The Ultramarines, veterans of Macrage and Behemoth's assault, threw themselves into the defense of the planet in a campaign that Marneus Calgar personally commanded. The battle was brutal and attritional, grinding through weeks of constant combat as Kraken poured organisms into the fighting in waves. But the Ultramarines held, and eventually the tendril-attacking Ichar IV was broken and destroyed. Combined with the Aeldari's defense of Iyanden, the back of Kraken's coherent advance was broken. The Hive fleet splintered, its remaining tendrils losing the coordinated momentum that had made them so dangerous, scattering in multiple directions. Some were hunted down by Imperial forces. Some went dormant, burrowing into the darkness to await a future opportunity. And some have never been fully accounted for, splinter fleets that dropped out of observation, whose subsequent fate and current location remain unknown to the Ordo Xenos. It is worth dwelling on that last point. The Hydra effect, named for the tendency of a Tyranid hive fleet to divide when attacked rather than be destroyed, means that a defeated fleet does not die cleanly. It breaks into pieces. Those pieces scatter across a vast area, each one potentially capable of evolving and growing back to dangerous size, given sufficient time and access to biomass. The galaxy after the Second Tyrannic War was not free of Tyranids. It was seeded with them, dormant splinter fleets nestled on dark worlds or burrowed into the crusts of barren planets, waiting. They are still waiting. There is also the matter of what the scythes of the Emperor did after losing their homeworld of Sotha. This is one of the more quietly moving stories in the whole of the Second Tyrannic War. A Space Marine chapter reduced from strength to a tiny remnant. Survivors gathered on whatever transports they could find, watching through observation ports as the fleet that consumed their home moved away. The Scythes made a choice in that moment that deserves recognition alongside every heroic last stand and grand orbital engagement in the narrative. They chose to continue. They set themselves the task of hunting splinter fleets of Kraken wherever they could be found, dedicating themselves as a chapter to fighting an enemy that had taken nearly everything from them. They did not rebuild and replenish in the conventional sense. They were too few for that, but they kept fighting, small strike forces probing into dangerous territory, keeping the chapter's identity and purpose alive in the face of near extinction. They became experts on Tyranid infiltration patterns and splinter fleet behavior. They paid for that expertise in blood, and they kept fighting anyway because the alternative was to let the swarm that consumed Sotha also consume the memory of what the chapter was. Section 8. Hive Fleet Leviathan, the Third and Fourth Tyrannic Wars. Just 5 years after the conclusion of the Second Tyrannic War, with the Imperium still nursing its wounds and the Eastern Fringe still recovering from Kraken's passage, the Ordo Xenos Inquisitor Fidus Cryptmon began detecting the signs he had hoped never to see again. Worlds going silent, astropathic signals dying, the shadow beginning to fall. Hive Fleet Leviathan was the largest Tyranid hive fleet ever encountered. Where Behemoth had been a battering ram and Kraken had been a net, Leviathan was a pair of jaws. It did not approach from the Eastern Fringe as both of its predecessors had done. Instead, it came from below the galactic plane, attacking from beneath in a two-pronged approach that formed an enormous closing mouth, with one tendril approaching from below and to the galactic south, while the other struck from below and to the galactic west. The two prongs were designed to close around a vast section of the galaxy, cutting off entire sectors from warp travel and communication, trapping entire populations within the closing teeth of the Hive Mind's assault. Cryptman's response was extreme enough that even the Inquisition eventually stripped him of his rank for it, though the debate over whether he was right has never fully been settled. He ordered the exterminatus of dozens of worlds in Leviathan's path. Not as an emergency measure, not as a last resort when planets were already falling, but as a preemptive strategy. He burned worlds before Leviathan could reach them, denying the Hive fleet the biomass it needed to sustain and grow its assault. Billions of people were killed. Centuries of civilization were erased, and the strategy worked, at least in terms of slowing Leviathan's advance. But even the Imperium has limits on how much it can stomach, and what Cryptman was doing crossed a line that the Inquisition's own internal ethics could not sanction. His most audacious gambit, however, was not exterminatus. In a move that combined genuine strategic brilliance with a complete willingness to roll the dice on a galaxy-scale catastrophe, Cryptman captured a brood of Genestealers and had them covertly inserted into Orc-held space, specifically into the territory of the Orc Empire of Octarius, home to one of the largest concentrations of greenskin life in the galaxy. The Genestealer infestation took hold, the broodmine beacon grew, and as Cryptman had calculated, the psychic signal drew a massive portion of Hive Fleet Leviathan away from its Imperial targets and toward the Orc worlds of the Octarius system. What followed became known as the Octarius War, arguably the most violent sustained conflict in the galaxy's recent history, as two of the most biologically unstoppable species in known existence threw themselves at each other across a cluster of star systems, each side feeding on the fighting, growing stronger, adapting. The Orcs grew bigger and more violent with every Tyranid they killed, because that is what Orcs do. The Tyranids grew more specialized and adaptive with every Orc they consumed, incorporating the remarkable physical resilience and biological aggression of the Orcish genome into their evolving swarm. It was a perfect, terrible arms race in miniature, and it kept both forces occupied and away from the Imperium for decades. The problem, of course, is that whichever side eventually emerges victorious from the Octarius War will emerge from it enormous, battle-hardened, genetically enriched by the conflict, and looking for the next war. Kryptman saved the Imperium from one catastrophe and potentially engineered another, worse catastrophe down the line. As of current 40K timeline, the Octarius War has ground on through multiple escalations, drawing in other factions, including elements of the Death Guard and the World Eaters, who were simply unable to resist a war that enormous. But the portion of Leviathan that was diverted to Octarius was not the whole fleet. Other tendrils continued pressing into Imperial space. One of the most notable pressed toward Baal, homeworld of the Blood Angels chapter, in the final years of the 41st millennium. The devastation of Baal was the largest gathering of the sons of Sanguinius since the end of the Horus heresy. 21 battle barges, 94 strike cruisers, and hundreds of smaller vessels, alongside the entirety of the Blood Angels and their successor chapters, under the command of Commander Dante, the longest-serving chapter master in the Imperium. Opposite them were more than 50,000 Tyranid bioships. When that number is written out, 50,000 living warships. It resists comprehension in a way that most facts about the Tyranids tend to. The Imperial fleet fought with extraordinary valor and inflicted massive casualties, and they were completely overwhelmed in space. One by one, battle barges were surrounded and torn apart by swarms of escort bioorganisms, their guns drained by living screens of expendable creatures, their hulls breached by boarding organisms that dissolved crew compartments with acid. The battle moved to Baal's surface. Wave after wave of mycetic spores fell through the atmosphere. The Blood Angels built a 3-layer defensive line. The first 19 waves were repulsed. The 20th broke through. The thirst water moat that formed part of the outermost defensive perimeter was filled with Tyranid bodies, used as stepping stones by the larger organisms behind them. The Swarm Lord, the ancient and effectively immortal commander of the Hive Mind's most challenging assaults, was present on the battlefield, personally directing the swarm against the Blood Angels' every tactical decision, learning from each engagement and adapting in real time. Dante killed the Swarm Lord, an exhausted, aged, battle-worn commander of the Angels, at the absolute limit of what even a genetically enhanced superhuman can endure, found the Swarm Lord in the carnage and destroyed it in single combat. It was one of the most remarkable feats of arms in the Tyrannic Wars. And the Swarm Lord, of course, will simply be regrown by the Hive Mind, with all its memories and all the knowledge gained from the battle with Dante, and will return to face the Imperium again. That is the nature of the creature. You cannot kill it permanently. You can only make it stronger. Baal was saved not by human arms alone, but by 2 simultaneous events. The Great Rift, the catastrophic tearing of reality that was the ultimate consequence of the 13th Black Crusade and Cadia's fall, erupted at the critical moment, cutting off the main body of the Leviathan from the fighting around Baal and pulling massive numbers of its bioships into the warp storm chaos. And almost simultaneously, the Indomitus Crusade under Primarch Robut Guilliman arrived, providing the drop assault that purged the surface and ended the immediate threat. Baal survived, but it was barely recognizable. The moons of Baal Prime and Baal Secundus had been stripped of life. The planet's surface was devastated. The Blood Angels had been reduced to a shadow of their former strength, saved only by the influx of Primaris Space Marines from the Crusade. And even this victory planted a dark seed. The Great Rift, which had cut Leviathan off from Baal, had also swallowed several Hive ships whole. When those ships were eventually expelled back into real space through the warp's unpredictable fluctuations, they emerged carrying bioforms with entirely new genetic characteristics, corrupted and altered by exposure to the raw chaos energy of the immaterium. Warp-touched Tyranids, a concept that should not work but apparently does, bearing mutations that no known weapon system has ever had to deal with before. The Fourth Tyrannic War, which began in the era now called the Era Indomitus, added a new dimension of terror to an already overwhelming situation. Leviathan launched a fresh massive offensive against the western reaches of Segmentum Pacificus, this time advancing both from above and below the galactic plane simultaneously in 3 massive new tendril groups, Nautilon, Promethor, and Grendilus, targeting a region much closer to Terra than any previous Tyranid advance. The Imperium, already fighting on dozens of fronts against chaos, orc invasions, Necron awakenings, and internal rebellions, found itself facing the largest Tyranid force yet recorded attacking from a direction it had not fully anticipated, targeting the solar approaches to the heart of the Imperium itself. Leviathan is still out there. The Fourth Tyrannic War is not over. The swarm continues to advance. Section 9. The Bioforms. Living weapons of the swarm. The Tyranid swarm is not one creature, or even one category of creature. It is an entire ecosystem, a complete biological hierarchy in which every organism occupies a specific niche and fulfills a specific function. The range and diversity of Tyranid bioforms is staggering, and no classification has ever been confident that it has cataloged all of them. New bioforms appear regularly, adapted for specific environments or challenges, and the Hive Mind shows no particular interest in limiting its variety when variety serves the purpose of the swarm. At the bottom of the hierarchy are the consumption organisms, the Rippers, tiny spiked devouring creatures that exist in swarms of millions, stripping organic matter from surfaces with mindless efficiency. The microorganisms that serve as the final stage of digestion, breaking down biomass into its component molecular elements. The spores and spore clouds that float through the atmosphere of invaded worlds, choking certain life forms and providing cover for larger organisms beneath them. Slightly larger and more combat-oriented are the basic assault organisms. Termagants are the primary ranged bioform, roughly the height of a crouching human, carrying flesh borers, organic weapons that fire larvae capable of burrowing through light armor before consuming the creature inside. They are not especially dangerous individually, but they exist in numbers that render individual danger largely irrelevant. A world might face 100,000 termagants in an initial wave, a number that strains any conventional defensive response. Hormagaunts are their melee counterparts, built for speed and close combat, four-bladed limbs working in furious combination that even a space marine in power armor has to work to counter when facing more than a handful simultaneously. Gargoyles fill the aerial role, winged organisms that swarm through the sky in masses that can darken the sun, providing cover for ground forces and delivering acid-spitting attacks against defensive emplacements. Raveners tunnel through the ground at speed, erupting beneath defensive lines and creating havoc in positions that believe themselves secure from flanking attacks. The mid-tier bioforms represent more specialized roles. Lictors, already discussed in the context of pre-invasion infiltration, are also devastating in direct combat, their multi-limbed bodies allowing them to attack from angles that conventional combat training doesn't prepare defenders to handle. Genestealers at full strength are among the most lethally efficient close combat organisms the swarm deploys, capable of dismantling heavily armored opponents with a speed that is almost impossible to follow visually. Then there are the synapse creatures, the psychic command nodes of the swarm, the organisms through which the hive mind exerts direct control. Tyranid warriors are the most commonly encountered synapse creatures, standing well above human height, combining reasonable durability with a range of weapon limb options that make them effective against various enemy types, and broadcasting the hive mind's synaptic authority to the lesser organisms nearby. Without synapse coverage, those lesser organisms revert to feral behavior, still dangerous, but no longer coordinated, no longer tactical, no longer adaptive in real time. Killing the synapse creatures is the most effective short-term tactic against a Tyranid swarm, and every experienced commander knows it. At the larger end of the scale, Carnifexes are the Tyranid equivalent of a main battle tank, heavily armored assault organisms that spearhead attacks on fortified positions, capable of absorbing enormous punishment while delivering devastating close combat destruction. The Screamer Killer variant, first encountered early in the Tyrannic Wars, is perhaps the most iconic. Its bioplasma discharge, emitting a shriek that has psychological as well as physical effects on nearby defenders. Old One-Eye, a legendary Carnifex encountered repeatedly on the world of Calth, has been reported slain on multiple occasions and has returned each time, its remarkable regenerative capacity making it effectively unkillable by any weapon available to the Ultramar defense forces. The Hive Tyrant is perhaps the most commanding single organism in a standard Tyranid invasion force, standing 3 times the height of a human, combining potent physical combat ability with devastating psychic powers and synapse command authority. The Hive Tyrant is the Hive Mind's primary battlefield commander. Unlike most Tyranid organisms, Hive Tyrants are described in Ordo Xenos assessments as genuinely self-aware and individually intelligent, capable of the kind of in-the-moment tactical improvisation that the lesser organisms cannot manage. They wield an enormous variety of weapon configurations, with individual Hive Tyrants growing different combinations of bioweapons based on the tactical requirements identified by the Hive Mind. The winged variant, a Hive Tyrant with enormous leathery wings capable of aerial superiority over a battlefield, is one of the more terrifying sights in any Tyranid assault. And then there is the Swarmlord. The Swarmlord is something categorically different from every other Tyranid organism. Where all other bioforms are tools of the Hive Mind, expendable in service of the larger purpose, the Swarmlord is the Hive Mind's primary instrument for those situations where conventional approaches have failed. It is the entity the Hive Mind creates when it needs a level of tactical brilliance and individual combat power that no standard organism can provide. The Swarmlord wields 4 bone sabers, each one crystalline at the core, with a growth not native to this galaxy, capable of cutting through adamantium and penetrating force fields as easily as other blades pass through flesh. It is possessed of more individual autonomy than any other Tyranid organism, more capable of independent strategic thought, more connected to the full weight of the Hive Mind's accumulated experience than anything else in the swarm. And it cannot be permanently killed. When the Swarmlord dies, the Hive Mind simply reconstructs it with every memory of its previous lives intact, every lesson learned, every enemy encountered understood. The Swarmlord that Commander Dante faced at the devastation of Baal had already died at Macragge against the Ultramarines, at Ikar 4 against Calgar, at dozens of other engagements across the history of the Tyrannic Wars. It came to Baal carrying the accumulated tactical experience of thousands of years of direct combat against the greatest warriors the Imperium has produced. And Dante killed it anyway, which remains one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of the Blood Angels. The Swarmlord has presumably been reborn since, carrying with it the memory of exactly how Dante killed it. Above even the Hive Tyrant in scale are the Bio-Titans, living siege weapons ranging from 9 to 30 meters in height, equivalents to the war machines fielded by the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Chaos Legions, but made entirely of flesh and bone and chitin rather than steel. The Hierophant Bio-Titan stands as one of the most massive land-based creatures ever encountered, capable of single-handedly devastating armored formations and support installations that would require significant conventional firepower to address. These organisms are rare even in the context of a major invasion, but their presence on a battlefield changes the calculus of the entire engagement immediately and absolutely. There is a category of Tyranid organisms that deserves extended discussion because they illustrate the swarm's approach to specialized roles with particular clarity. The organisms designed not for direct combat, but for psychological and environmental disruption. The zoanthrope is among the most psychically potent organisms in the swarm, a creature that has been designed to use the raw power of the Hive Mind as a weapon, floating, physically frail but terrifyingly powerful in its psychic output, capable of projecting concentrated blasts of bioplasmic energy that reduce tanks to slag and fortifications to rubble. The zoanthrope also projects the shadow in the warp at a localized level, creating a sphere of psychic interference that denies nearby psychers their abilities. The biovore is a strange and unsettling organism, a slug-like creature that functions as living artillery, its entire body dedicated to the production and launch of spore mines, organic floating organisms that drift through the air and detonate against anything that touches them. The biovore is sessile, barely capable of movement, with no direct combat capability. It exists purely to manufacture these weapons and discharge them in the direction the Hive Mind indicates. Its design is a philosophical statement about the Tyranid approach. Every organism serves its function and nothing beyond it. The biovore does not fight, it does not flee. It manufactures ordnance and delivers it until it cannot, and then it dies. The Trigon is another particularly interesting organism, a massive tunneling creature that burrows through the subsurface rock of invaded worlds at high speed, erupting beneath defensive positions in a spray of earth and shattered rock that creates exactly the kind of chaos the swarm exploits. Trigons establish tunnel networks beneath the battlefield that smaller organisms can use for rapid underground movement, effectively removing the concept of a stable defensive line from the equation. You cannot hold a position against Tyranids because the position can be undermined literally. The defense you built on the surface may be solid, but there is something enormous digging toward it from below, and it will arrive faster than you expect. Then there is the Lictor family of organisms, already mentioned in the context of pre-invasion reconnaissance, but worth revisiting in terms of their direct combat role once an invasion begins in earnest. The Death Leaper is perhaps the most celebrated of these, a named Lictor organism with a history of particularly successful targeted disruption, killing commanders and key personnel across multiple campaigns with such efficiency that the Ordo Xenos maintains a dedicated file on its activities. The Death Leaper does not simply kill, it hunts specific individuals identified by the Hive Mind as important obstacles, and it does so with a patience and methodical calculation that is deeply unsettling when you realize that this creature has been watching you, following your movements, waiting for exactly the right moment, with a mind utterly focused on your elimination for whatever duration the mission requires. There is also the Tervagon, a relatively recent addition to the documented bioform catalog, a massive organism that serves as a living spawning unit, producing termagants from its body during combat and pushing them directly into the battle. The Tervagon is the Hive Mind's solution to the problem of tactical reserve. Instead of needing to call in a second wave from orbit, the Tervagon generates its own additional forces on the spot, maintaining a constant flow of fresh bodies into the combat regardless of casualties. Fighting a Tyranid assault supported by a Tervagon is fighting an enemy whose numbers increase as the battle progresses, which inverts every conventional principle of military attrition. The Haruspex is one of the newer bioforms documented in the Fourth Tyrannic War, and its function is grimly specific. It is a harvesting organism, designed to extract the biomass from the battlefield and prepare it for absorption while the fighting continues around it. It does not fight in the conventional sense, though it is more than capable of defending itself. Its purpose is to consume the dead, on both sides, during the battle itself, digesting bodies and transferring the nutrient content to digestion pools and eventually to the hive ships above. It is the embodiment of the swarm's biological efficiency. Nothing is wasted, not even the casualties of an ongoing battle. Finally, there are the Norn emissaries, already mentioned but worth examining in more detail. These massive organisms are not deployed as general battlefield commanders or as shock troops. They are assassins, built to the most demanding specifications the Hive Mind can achieve, sent with a singular mandate: find this specific individual and end them. A Norn emissary is provided with its target's psychic signature before deployment, and it will pursue that signature across any terrain and through any opposition until it reaches its target or until something manages to kill it, which is considerably easier said than done for an organism that exceeds a hive tyrant in size and receives the full directed support of the Hive Mind. The existence of the Norn emissary is also a fascinating piece of Hive Mind psychology, to the extent that the phrase Hive Mind psychology means anything. The creature was apparently developed as a specific counter to the Imperium's use of hero figures, the Chapter Masters, the Primarchs, the Inquisitor Lords, whose personal reputation and combat ability carries disproportionate weight in morale and command effectiveness. The Hive Mind identified that certain individuals have an impact on Imperial military performance that vastly exceeds their statistical contribution as individual combatants. And so, it built an organism specifically designed to remove those individuals from the equation. It is the swarm's recognition that human warfare has a human heart, and that heart can be reached and stopped. This is the range of the Tyranid bioform catalog. This is what descends on a world, not just a number of organisms, not just a quantity of biomass moving in a direction, but a precisely engineered ecosystem of specialized organisms, each one filling its role with biological perfection, each one contributing to the single overwhelming purpose of the whole. When you face the Tyranids, you are not fighting an army, you are fighting a system. Section 10. Why the Tyranids are more dangerous than chaos. This section is going to be somewhat deliberately argumentative, because the question of which threat is most dangerous in the 40K setting generates genuine and interesting debate. Chaos gets much more narrative focus in the overall lore, much more prominence in the major campaign events, and in many discussions is treated as the de facto most dangerous threat. There are good arguments for that position, but there is an equally strong case, stronger in some ways, that the Tyranids represent a more fundamentally dangerous threat over any meaningful timescale, and that the gap between how dangerous they actually are and how often they are treated as the primary concern of the setting's powers is one of the most important pieces of world building in 40K. Let's start with the obvious comparison. Chaos is powerful. Chaos is arguably the most powerful force in the setting, in terms of raw metaphysical weight. The Chaos Gods are entities of essentially limitless power within the immaterium. Their influence pervades every warp-touched creature in the galaxy, and the possibility of the Eye of Terror expanding until it swallows all of real space is a genuine existential risk. The corruption of chaos is insidious. The demonic legions are terrifying, and the Chaos Space Marines represent the best warriors humanity ever produced, turned against everything the Imperium stands for. But consider the structural vulnerabilities of chaos as a threat. The Chaos Gods do not cooperate with each other. This is not a minor observation. The Big Four, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slaanesh, are in fundamental opposition. Khorne despises Slaanesh. Tzeentch and Nurgle are cosmic opposites. The Chaos Gods spend the vast majority of their attention fighting each other in the Great Game, not focusing on the mortal realm. Even at its most catastrophically successful, the Horus Heresy, the 13th Black Crusade, chaos has ultimately failed to achieve the final victory it periodically seems to approach. And here is the key structural reality. Chaos feeds on the emotions and souls of living creatures. If everything in the galaxy dies, chaos starves. The Chaos Gods cannot ultimately destroy all life without destroying themselves. The Tyranids have no such limitation. They do not feed on souls. They feed on biomass, on physical matter. Every creature consumed becomes fuel for more creatures, and more fuel, and more fuel. The more they eat, the more they can grow, and there is no theoretical upper limit to their growth, because the supply of matter in the galaxy is not something they can run out of. They will eat the chaos-corrupted worlds. They will eat the Necron tomb worlds. They will eat whatever remains when every other faction has spent itself fighting. They have no factional allies to betray them, no internal politics to generate weaknesses, no gods whose agendas sometimes conflict with the mortal realm's destruction. They have one agenda and zero internal contradiction about pursuing it. The Necrons are often cited as a counterbalance to the Tyranids. And to their credit, the Silent King's decision to unite the Necron dynasties in the modern 40K era was at least partially motivated by the recognition that the Tyranids represent a greater threat than anything else. The Necrons are effectively immortal, immune to corruption, able to rebuild from almost anything, and possess technology so advanced that even the Imperium's most sophisticated weaponry is medieval by comparison. But the Necrons are metal. The Tyranids cannot eat metal in any meaningful way, which is often cited as the main structural counter to Tyranid consumption, and it's true to a degree. But it also means the Necrons, if they achieve their goal of stripping the galaxy of all biological life, simply leave behind a galaxy of dead metal stars, orbited by barren rocks and inhabited by soulless machines. That outcome, for most of the living beings in the galaxy, is only marginally less catastrophic than being consumed. The Tyranids' relationship to chaos is particularly interesting because the shadow in the warp is not just a communications blocker, it also functions as a fundamental psychic barrier between a Tyranid-affected area and the warp. Chaos cannot easily reach through the shadow. Demonic entities that thrive in the corruption of vulnerable psychic beings find nothing to grab onto in Tyranid-held space. The Tyranids are, in their own inadvertent way, one of the most effective counters to demonic incursion, not through any deliberate intent, but simply because their nature is so utterly incompatible with what chaos needs to operate. An entire sector consumed by the Tyranids is a sector that chaos has lost access to, because there are no souls left for the dark gods to feast on. This creates a grimly ironic dynamic in the 40k setting. The Tyranids and Chaos are, in a sense, natural enemies, not because either faction has any interest in the other, but because their respective methods of consuming the galaxy are mutually exclusive. Every world the Tyranids eat is a world Chaos cannot corrupt. Every world Chaos corrupts is a world with tainted biomass that the Tyranids find less useful. They are competing for the same resource, the living galaxy, from opposite directions. Chaos wins in the short term, generally, because it is already inside the gates. The corruption has been spreading for 10,000 years. The Tyranids are still coming in from outside, still in the invasion phase. But the Tyranids are patient in a way that Chaos is not. The Hive Mind does not get bored. It does not indulge in the infighting that perpetually holds Chaos back. It does not face the limitations of needing to keep a galaxy alive to feed from it. When the Tyranids complete their consumption of the Milky Way, if they complete it, there will be nothing left for Chaos to claim. The Eldar prophecy cited in certain 40k texts is worth noting here. There is an ancient divination that speaks of the Hive Mind eventually splitting, of the swarm consuming itself in an internal war, of this self-destruction providing the galaxy's populations with a window of survival. Whether this is genuine foresight, wishful thinking, or Eldari political manipulation of human beliefs to direct their behavior in useful directions is unclear. But it illustrates how even among the oldest and most prescient beings in the galaxy, the Tyranid threat is perceived as something that may only be survived through the enemy's own eventual failure, not through any combination of forces that the galaxy can currently muster. That is perhaps the most honest summary of where the 40k galaxy stands in relation to the Tyranids, fighting for time, holding actions and desperate defenses, hoping that the numbers being fed into the grinder are enough to delay the next wave long enough for something to change. Not a plan, not a strategy, just a species refusing to die for as long as it can. There is one more comparison worth making before we move on, and it is perhaps the most uncomfortable one. The Imperium of Man is, in many ways, the defining narrative anchor of the 40k setting. Its history, its wars, its heroes, its terrible compromises are the lens through which most of the setting is experienced. And the Imperium's relationship with the Tyranid threat is one of the most revealing aspects of how the faction is written. Because the Imperium is, fundamentally, very bad at taking the Tyranid threat seriously until it has already become catastrophic. After Behemoth, the Administratum argued the threat was over. After Kraken, there was a 5-year window before Leviathan arrived, a window that was not used to substantially increase the defensive posture on the Tyranid front, but to argue about resource allocation and political priority within the Byzantine structures of imperial governance. After the devastation of Baal and the birth of the Fourth Tyrannic War, the Imperium is fighting on so many fronts simultaneously that its ability to direct appropriate resources to the Tyranid threat is constantly compromised by more immediately visible emergencies. This is not a criticism of the Imperium as a fictional construct. It is, in fact, one of the most authentically human things about the setting. Humanity, throughout its history, has shown a remarkable capacity for focusing on the immediate and visible crisis over the larger, slower-moving existential threat. The Tyranids move at the timescale of centuries. Imperial politics and military planning moves at the timescale of decades. The mismatch in these timescales is structural, and the Tyranids do not care that the mismatch exists. They simply advance and consume and advance again. And the fact that the beings they are consuming are dealing with other problems at the same time does not slow them down. The most prescient minds in the Imperium understand this. Inquisitor Cryptman, for all his extreme methods, understood the mathematics of the Tyranid invasion better than almost anyone else, and his willingness to burn worlds and engineer galaxy-scale proxy wars came from a genuine, if extreme, understanding of what the alternative looked like. Chaplain Orton Cassius of the Ultramarines, who has devoted himself so completely to the study of Tyranid combat that he has become the chapter's primary authority on their tactics, understands that expertise alone is not enough, that the enemy keeps changing, keeps adapting, and that every engagement teaches them something that will be used against you eventually. The librarians who have attempted to make contact with the Hive Mind and survived, a vanishingly small number, Describe an encounter with a consciousness so vast and so fundamentally indifferent that the experience of touching it leaves permanent psychological marks. The Tyranids are underrated because they are hard to hate. Chaos generates emotion. The Necrons generate a kind of aristocratic menace. The Orcs generate volume and color, and the anarchic energy of things that like fighting. The Tyranids generate nothing but the cold, patient certainty of consumption. And that kind of threat is psychologically harder to sustain fear toward than a threat with a face. The Swarm does not declare war. It does not send ambassadors. It does not deliver ultimatums. It simply arrives, and the silence that precedes its arrival is the only announcement you get. That silence is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. Pay attention when it falls. Section 11. The true scale of the threat. Splinter fleets and what lies beyond. We have spent most of this script discussing the three major hive fleets, Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan, as if they are the primary measure of the Tyranid threat. They are the ones with names, the ones with documented engagements, the ones whose casualties and conquests have been recorded in the archives of the Ordo Xenos. But they are not the totality of the threat. They are not even close. The galaxy in the 42nd millennium is littered with Tyranid presences that have no convenient name, no official designation, no established pattern of behavior. Splinter fleets, the fragments produced whenever a major hive fleet is shattered or divided, have been scattering into the dark places of the galaxy for hundreds of years. Some are small, a handful of bioships, a few tens of thousands of organisms, enough to threaten a poorly defended agricultural world, but nothing that should challenge a serious military installation. Others are growing quietly in the shadows, feeding on isolated systems and uninhabited worlds, building their biomass reserves, waiting. The Hydra effect, as mentioned earlier, ensures that these splinters persist. When a Norn Queen dies, the psychic backlash of its death triggers nearby bioships to produce new Norn Queens in a rapid cascade, so that what should be a fatal blow to the fleet's reproductive capacity becomes instead a multiplication event. Kill one Norn Queen, get 3. The Imperium has learned this lesson through painful experience. The destruction of a major Tyranid fleet does not eliminate the threat. It redistributes it. The threat becomes smaller and more numerous, harder to track, harder to catch, embedded deeper in the territory where it can feed and grow unobserved. There are also Tyranid presences on many worlds that have been on the receiving end of previous invasions. Even worlds that were defended successfully, that fought off a wave of Tyranid organisms and declared victory, often harbor remnants. Ripper organisms burrowing deep into the planet's crust. Spore deposits in the upper atmosphere, dormant but viable, waiting for conditions to improve. Genestealers surviving in remote locations, cut off from the hive fleet but capable of surviving independently for extended periods and potentially founding new cults given enough time. After the Second Tyrannic War, the Adeptus Mechanicus conducted exterminatus on several worlds whose Tyranid infestation seemed to have been neutralized by other means, and discovered that the bioforms had simply gone into subterranean hibernation, safely insulated from the surface action. Hive Fleet Kronos deserves mention in this context, as one of the more recent named fleets, developed in the post-Great Rift setting. Unlike the other fleets, Kronos appears to have developed specifically in response to the chaos corruption that now pervades much of the galaxy through the Great Rift. Its organisms are notably adapted for anti-psychic and anti-chaos purposes. Specifically evolved, it appears, to cut through chaos-corrupted environments and consume the biomass within them, filtering or neutralizing the warp taint in ways that allow the hive mind to benefit from what would otherwise be spoiled material. The hive mind is adapting to the post-Rift galaxy in real time, developing new tools for consuming a galaxy that has changed since the invasion began. Hive Fleet Gorgon is another fleet worth understanding on its own terms. Attacking from the eastern fringe, Gorgon specialized in adaptive hypertoxins, weaponized spore clouds, and biological poisons of extraordinary sophistication. It targeted agri-worlds, the farming planets that feed the Imperium's enormous population, with particular focus, using its spore cloud attacks to contaminate food sources with dangerous Tyranid organisms before the food was shipped throughout the Imperium. The implication of a Tyranid strategy specifically designed to inject their genetic material into the food supply of a galactic civilization is disturbing on multiple levels. It is not just an attack on food production. It is potentially the slow seeding of Genestealer genetic material across hundreds of worlds simultaneously, through vectors the Imperium has no screening process to detect. Gorgon was ultimately defeated by the Tau, and the forces of the Imperium working in parallel, though not in formal alliance. The Tau suffered catastrophically in the campaign, their sept of Kelshawn nearly wiped out by the assault. The hypertoxins Gorgon deployed had never been encountered before, and posed a genuine problem for defenders who had prepared for physical assault, rather than biological warfare, at this level of sophistication. Even after Gorgon's defeat, the Adeptus Mechanicus reported that certain of its poison strains had escaped containment and continued to spread through the biospheres of affected worlds. Then there is Hive Fleet Tiamat, perhaps the strangest and most theoretically significant of the minor fleets. Tiamat did something no other Hive fleet has been observed doing. It stopped consuming. Instead of stripping the worlds it encountered, Tiamat took over the Tiamat system and began funneling all available biomass toward the construction of an enormous structure on the planet Xyophoria, a structure of unknown purpose, a tower that grows and grows, incorporating organic material at a continuous rate, reaching ever higher into the planet's atmosphere. No reliable intelligence about what this structure is intended to do has been gathered. The most terrifying theory, not officially confirmed but widely discussed, is that it is a beacon, a massive biological transmitter powered by the biomass of an entire star system, designed to broadcast a psychic signal across the intergalactic void. To reach the main body of the Tyranid fleet, still traveling through the dark between galaxies, and tell them, here, we are here. This is the galaxy. This is the feast. Come. Hive Fleet Jormungandr is also worth discussion as an example of the sheer tactical variety the Tyranids deploy. Where Behemoth had been a battering ram and Kraken a net, Jormungandr specializes in something much more patient and deeply troubling: attacks from below. The organisms of Jormungandr have been specifically evolved for subterranean warfare, burrowing deep into the crusts of target worlds and attacking infrastructure from underneath rather than from above. Defenders who have prepared for the classic Tyranid assault of swarming organisms from mycetic spores find instead that the ground beneath their fortifications simply gives way, that the support columns for their artillery emplacements have been silently chewed through over the course of days, that their underground bunker networks, carefully built to provide refuge from surface bombardment, have been colonized by organisms waiting in the dark. Jormungandr attacks in silence, which is appropriate for a fleet named after the world serpent of myth. Its assault begins before any defender realizes it has begun, which means the opening stages of a Jormungandr invasion look, from the outside, exactly like a world not being invaded. The first signs are often structural failures, buildings collapsing for no obvious reason, tunnels caving in, drainage systems backing up because they have been blocked by something biological. By the time these signs are correctly interpreted, the Jormungandr organisms are already throughout the planet's subsurface infrastructure. Hive Fleet Hydra represents a different form of terror: rapid expansion and overwhelming numbers, a fleet that has evolved to prioritize quantity of production over quality of individual organisms, flooding its targets with such an overwhelming concentration of lower-tier bioforms that even heavily defended worlds can be ground down by simple arithmetic. Hydra's approach is the least sophisticated of the major minor fleets in terms of tactical complexity, but it is deeply effective against worlds that have been weakened by prior engagements or depleted by other demands. Hydra hits where the Imperium is already stretched, and it hits with numbers that strain counting. What all of these splinter fleets and minor Hive fleets share, what all of them illustrate, is the fundamental diversity of the Tyranid approach. Each fleet is not merely a renamed version of the last one. Each represents a genuinely different evolutionary approach to the same problem, adapted to different environments, different defensive strategies, different prey. The Hive Mind is not applying one solution to every situation. It is maintaining a portfolio of solutions, and it can select from that portfolio based on what the target requires. A world defended primarily through underground fortifications gets Jormungandr. A world with extensive psychic defenses gets Chronos. A world with massive surface fortifications gets the raw weight of Hydra's numbers. The Hive Mind has been gathering tactical data for centuries, and its ability to match fleet methodology to target type is becoming more refined with each passing decade. There is also, finally, the matter of what happens to worlds that have been touched by Tyranid presence and survived, long after the immediate threat has passed. The ecosystem of such worlds is never quite the same. Spore clouds that settled into soil have altered its chemistry in ways that favor certain types of plant growth over others. Plant growth that is, in a subtle way, more hospitable to future Tyranid organisms. Ripper organisms that burrowed deep and entered stasis continue to wake intermittently when conditions trigger their dormancy protocols, creating reports of Tyranid activity on worlds that were cleared years or even decades ago. And the people who live through the touch of the shadow in the warp carry their own changes. A statistical elevation in psychic sensitivity in the populations of survivor worlds, a tendency toward particular types of dreams, a community-level change in how the concept of the sky is processed by people whose minds were touched by the psychic pressure of the Hive Mind's proximity. The Tyranids do not just take what they eat, they change what they don't take, and they do so in ways that make the next visit easier. Every world that has ever been touched by the swarm carries a faint biological memory of that touch, and the Hive Mind holds the key to reading it. The Silent King of the Necrons, the entity called Zarek, who spent 60 million years in exile in the intergalactic void and has seen with his own metal eyes what the Tyranids leave behind them, returned to the Milky Way with a specific purpose: to convince the factions of this galaxy to unite against the Tyranid threat. He has seen what happens when they succeed. He watched them consume his galaxy before he fled. He knows in a way that no being in the Milky Way can fully comprehend exactly what is coming. The Silent King has tried. He has brokered temporary alliances, shared intelligence, pointed his warriors against the swarm at critical moments. But convincing factions to stop fighting each other long enough to face a common enemy is, in the 41st and 42nd millennia, a task that makes draining the ocean with a cup look straightforward by comparison. The Imperium fights chaos. Chaos corrupts the Imperium. The Orcs fight everyone. The Tau maintain their borders. The Aeldari pursue their own inscrutable agenda. And the Tyranids continue to advance, patient and hungry and absolutely certain of the outcome, in the way that entropy is certain of the outcome. Not because they care about winning, but because what they do is simply what they are, and nothing in the galaxy has yet found a way to make them stop being it. Consider what the galaxy looked like from the Tyranid perspective, if such a perspective could exist in the current era. In M42, the Imperium is torn between the Great Rift that has split it in two, the ongoing catastrophe of the Fourth Tyrannic War, the awakening of the Necrons under the Silent King, the chaos invasions pouring through the rift, and a dozen smaller crises that in any previous age would have been considered civilization-ending events in their own right. Every faction is dealing with multiple existential threats simultaneously. Attention, resources, and military force are being divided in ways that would have been unthinkable even a century before. The Tyranids advance into this situation with the implacable patience of a force that has been crossing intergalactic space for millions of years and has no deadline except the one set by the available biomass. They are not rushed. They do not have political cycles to deal with, or factional opponents to manage, or supply chains to protect. They simply move forward, consuming, adapting, growing, and the chaos of the galaxy's internal conflicts is, from their perspective, simply what prey does in its final moments. The most honest thing that can be said about the Tyranid threat in the context of the 40K setting is that it is a threat without an ending. There is no deus ex machina waiting in the wings. There is no ancient weapon hidden somewhere that will destroy the Hive Mind if only the right person can find it. The Tyranids are simply the universe's biological imperative, the fact that something will consume everything eventually. They are entropy given hunger. They are the heat death of the galaxy, wearing a billion faces of chitin and acid. And they will keep coming, because that is what they are. They are not motivated by malice, or ambition, or ideology. They don't hate the galaxy. They don't want to rule it. They want to eat it. and they have been traveling across the void for millions of years to get here. And the hive fleets we have fought were, by the testimony of beings who have seen the main fleet at distance, barely a drop of what is coming. The most terrifying sentence in the Warhammer 40k lore is not some speech by a chaos god, or some pronouncement by the Emperor, or some declaration of war by the Necrons. It is a quiet line in the assessments of Ordo Xenos scholars, repeated in slightly different forms across multiple codexes and source materials. The hive fleets encountered thus far are just the furthest stretched tendrils of the main Tyrannid invasion fleet, which is still traveling through the void. Sit with that. Let it settle. The first Tyrannic War. The second. The third. The fourth. All the consumed worlds. All the billions of dead. All the heroic last stands and desperate defenses and Pyrrhic victories. All of it, every bit of it, was the outriders. The main body is still out there, still coming, still centuries or millennia away, still utterly indifferent to whether the advanced scouts found what they were looking for or not. Because the main fleet is so large that the loss of every bioship in every hive fleet ever catalogued by the Imperium would not diminish it perceptibly. That is why the Tyranids are the underrated threat in Warhammer 40k. Not because they are ignored entirely, they are clearly not ignored. They have been the subject of 3 full Tyrannic Wars and are currently in the middle of a 4th. But because the scale of what they represent is so large, so absolute, and so beyond the comprehension of the beings trying to fight them, that even the people who study them most closely have to compartmentalize the full reality of it in order to function. Because if you truly believed, in the full weight of its implication, that everything you were doing was a rearguard action against something that was going to win eventually, that every victory was buying time and nothing more, that the tide would keep coming forever because the sea never runs dry, you might not be able to pick up the bolter anyway. You might not be able to tell the next generation of PDF troopers to stand on the wall and hold the line. So you fight. You win when you can, you die when you have to, and you trust that maybe something will change. Maybe the Eldar prophecy is right. Maybe the hive mind will fracture. Maybe the Silent King will find a way. Maybe a weapon that doesn't exist yet will be created. Maybe the sheer bloody-minded refusal of humanity and the Eldari and the Tau, and even the Orcs and Necrons to simply lie down and be consumed will, against all odds and mathematics, be enough. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, that stubborn refusal is the only hope that exists, and it will have to be enough. If you made it all the way through this, you now know more about the Tyranid threat than most inhabitants of the 41st millennium ever get to know before they meet it. That is either a comfort or it isn't. If this was the kind of deep dive into 40k lore you're here for, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. There is so much more to explore in this universe. The individual histories of specific hive fleets, the biological mechanics of specific bioforms, the campaigns that almost broke the Imperium, the warriors who held when everything said they shouldn't have. Drop a comment below. What do you think is the most terrifying aspect of the Tyranid threat? Is it the shadow in the warp, the biological recycling, the sheer scale, or something else entirely? I read every single one. Until next time, stay vigilant. And remember, the silence before the swarm arrives is the only warning you get.